Thank you, Dan. I wanted to just start by congratulating Steve and Jon on pulling this off. We've been involved in conversations really since close to the beginning of Metrics and watching Metrics take a direction, and this conference was a little glimmer in their eyes some time ago, so it's very cool to see everybody here and to see the thriving conversation that's happened so far. I'm going to do my best to just throw two ideas out in my few moments here. And the first of these ideas comes from, push the right button, this article that you have seen already. This is Brian Nossek's paper that was published in Science, the title being Estimating the Reproducibility of Psychological Science. And you know that this is the kind of key figure from the paper, and the important thing about this figure is the pink dots. Those are the many studies that failed to reproduce original results. There were lots of them, and so this then became of interest, for example, to the New York Times, who said the following: "Psychology's fear confirmed, rechecked studies don't hold up." That was the headline in the print version of this article. And among the statements in the article were this statement: "The vetted studies were considered part of the core knowledge by which scientists understand the dynamics of personality, relationships, learning, and memory. Therapists and educators rely on such findings to help guide decisions, and the fact that so many of the studies were called into question could sow doubt in the scientific underpinnings of their work." Except, not really. As it turns out, these were studies taken from the very leading journals in psychology in 2008. These journals have extremely high standards for publication. And so what they publish are new discoveries, insights, innovations, important progress forward. So in fact, what is in these journals are typically the first reports of phenomena rather than findings that are at the core of any discipline. Yet they may become the core of the discipline, but they are not yet the core of the discipline when they're published for the first time in the most prestigious journals. It's the beginning of that process. And so obviously, the failures to reproduce those findings raise important questions, but they may be conditional on the particular studies that were investigated. And so what about, in fact, core knowledge? What about findings that have been studied for decades, and that if you asked any social psychologist, what do we know to be true about the way people interact and think? If we were to look at those core findings, how readily would they hold up? Because, in fact, most of those have already been replicated many times in published journals. There's every reason to imagine, though, that the facts that we worry led to the failures to reproduce in Brian's case might also be responsible for failures to reproduce these studies as well. So what I want to do is tell you about a study that we did where we attempted to replicate what I would actually call core knowledge. So here are a series of findings under the heading of heuristics and biases in social judgment. I'm not going to explain these to you, but if you know them, you'll recognize them as being in every introductory textbook in social psychology. So heuristics and biases in judgment, a supercategory; persuasion, the next one; conformity to a social norm; and lastly, the ease of retrieval effect on self-perceptions. These are ideas that are accepted to be true. So we set out to replicate them, but in a bit of an unusual way. That unlike the body of evidence supporting them, mostly based upon studies of college students taking psychology courses, we set out to replicate these studies in representative national samples of American adults, about whom, of course, the findings are typically taken to provide insight. That is, when a group of psychologists were asked to consult with presidential candidates running for office to lead the country, they relied on exactly this literature to make recommendations about how to convince Americans to vote for that candidate. So how many of these effects replicated in our efforts? Well, it turns out the yellow ones replicated. Only the red one did not. So the good news is, in this case, I think the verdict is that actually what probably would be closer to core knowledge of the field does stand up very well to an independent replication with a very different group of people. Now, I will tell you, with this last one, we have now run about 22,000 participants through that last study design. And I think we have finally figured out what has caused the illusion of it in the literature. And I think the fact of the matter is it was an effect that was never there in the first place. And so that's a concern, but it's not highly prevalent. But here's the important finding that comes out of this. The average effect size in these studies is this first bar here that happens to come out at 1. This is, the effect size of the original study that was published to document the effect for the first time. Now what I'm going to show you is the average effect size of the replication studies of it, many of them, and it is notably lower. This is what is thought of as the decline effect sometimes, that you trying to reproduce a finding inevitably, according to this perspective, leads to a weaker effect. Could be for many reasons. It turns out for all of these that we looked at, it is true. But here's maybe the most interesting finding of all, which is in our replication with a representative national sample, the effect size gets even weaker. So what happens strongly among college students, for the most part, happens, but it happens more weakly in the general public. Now you might say, we're not doing research on effect sizes, we're just doing research to find out whether this treatment impacts people. But if you read the psychological literature, it doesn't look like that. Psychologists are fascinated with effect sizes and talk about the sizes of the effects observed in studies of college students as if they are generalizable broadly. So this raises the possibility that maybe those effect sizes are stated to be a little bit stronger than maybe they really are. But there's a surprising ending to this story. Let me just say that our finding of declined effect sizes is not unique. In fact, the headline on the New York Times article about Brian's study that appears online, this is now a different headline from the one that was in print, talks about effect sizes. Many psychology findings not as strong as claimed. So that's a second key finding from his paper, is that effect sizes in his replications are weaker than in the original studies. So this starts to look like a kind of prevalent phenomenon. And now here's the punchline, that in our case, I've shown you these 3 bars already. The 4th bar I'm going to show you now takes our national survey data and does a simulation. It simply looks at what would the effect size be if the only participants were people with the characteristics of college students. That is, young adults, highly educated, high income, turns out come maybe mainly from the Northeast, a series of demographic characteristics which, as it turns out, moderate the size of the effect. And here it is. So when you simulate the effect size with the survey data for the people with the characteristics of the folks studied in the second column, the last column looks just like the second column. So it isn't the case that there's something different about a survey setting. What's different is the people. Okay, so it turns out this is also not a new finding. You might remember hearing that in 1948, the Chicago Daily Tribune newspaper made a big mistake. They published the front page of the paper saying that Dewey defeated Truman in the race for president of the United States based upon pre-election polls rather than based upon the actual count of the vote. And as it turns out, you might remember Thomas Dewey did not win the presidency and Harry Truman did. And here are the survey data that, I'm sorry, I don't think, do I have a pointer here? I don't think I have a pointer. Is this, oh, I do have a pointer. Okay, so here are the real, this is the real election outcome, 50 for Truman, 45 for Dewey. These are the 3 leading polls that were done at the time, Gallup, Roper, and Crosley. You can see in each of these cases, they've got Dewey winning. Of course, if you're the newspaper, you print the paper in advance. Why not? Obviously. Small problem, that none of these samples were random samples of the American population. They were all people who volunteered to do surveys. And interestingly, in that very same year, ta-da, the academics come along. The University of Michigan did the American National Election Study for the first time with a random sample of American adults, and this is the result that they got. They got Harry Truman winning properly. So what does this show? It shows that if you want to measure something, a random sample helps. and that's certainly not a unique finding. This is a graph that shows you the distribution of errors. So these are a series of measurements made in surveys. Let's just say what percent of Americans have a passport, as compared to what the State Department says is the percent of Americans who have a passport. And these are the, sorry, let's see, now how do I get back here? Yes, these are the frequencies here, the proportion of measures with 0 percentage points error, 1 percentage point of error, and so on. For probability samples, the errors are very clustered around 0. So if anybody tells you, and if you read a couple weeks ago in the New Yorker magazine an essay saying surveys are hopelessly broken, they're not. This is the rate of accuracy. But when you use non-probability samples of volunteers who do surveys, anybody who comes along, people who do MTurk, people who do surveys for commercial companies that seek volunteers, this is what the distribution of errors looks like. They're in general not so clustered around 0, and occasionally you get gigantic errors. So again, you might say, who cares? This doesn't really matter. These are measurements of points. They're not measurements of effects, which is what psychologists care about. Before we get into the effects, let me just show you a couple of other key points. So this is now, I'm going to contrast for you, a simple question. Did you go out to the movies in the last 30 days or not? And so according to a probability sample survey, 30% of people in the American public said that they had done that. This is the result from 7 different providers like Mechanical Turk who put together people who volunteer to do studies. And as you can see, these estimates range from about right, 31, up to clearly not right at about 81. They're all over the board. Is this surprising? Probably not. Here's another one. Did you see a movie in the last month? These results vary dramatically as well. This is the random sample, 52. These range anywhere from 60 up to 90. So, fine. Measurements of single points don't do much. What about effects? So I'm going to show you quickly 3 experiments. This is the first experiment where in a full sample, this is the treatment effect. You don't need to know what the treatment is, you just need to know there's a highly significant treatment effect. When we replicated this very same experiment with a series of different non-probability samples, 1,000 people each, this is just 2 experimental conditions, 500 per condition, lots of power. Here's what we get. It replicates significantly for this one and this one. It's in the right direction non-significantly for these 2, and it's not even there for those 2. The next one, there's just 3 of these. This is the effect that's highly significant. It replicates significantly for 4 and does not for the other 3. Here's the last one, highly significant. It replicates for 4, not for the other 3. So the important point is, it's not like a couple of these providers are consistently failing and others are consistently succeeding. That I could be any one of those 7. I could be the crapshoot. The first one could be the first study that I try, and then the second one is the second attempt at reproducing the same thing. Doesn't happen. So why does this happen? Why so many failures to replicate? Well, I guarantee you it's not small samples. It's not p-hacking, because I haven't done any p-hacking here. It's not sloppy analysis. We were very careful. It's not over-reliance on unsupervised graduate students. It's in the data. And so the proposal that I will end with is, it's the people. That if we allow our sampling of people to be uncontrolled, we are begging for inconsistencies in results, because we know in our literatures that characteristics of individuals are moderators of so many effects. It doesn't, whether it's gender or education or income or extroversion or need for cognition, there are endless variables that the literature shows are moderators. And so if effects are going to be contingent on those attributes, why would we think that arbitrary samples of people would always reproduce the same effects? We wouldn't. So I would suggest that we have a choice. The choice that we have is either to continue to arbitrarily study whomever we happen to get and continue to see non-replications while at the same time reporting moderation by individual differences. And by the way, this isn't only true in psychology, as you know. In medicine as well, studies of breast cancer involve find 100 people with breast cancer. It's not an effort to do some kind of random sample of breast cancer victims. Or we could start doing systematic sampling of well-defined populations. It seems to me it's a hypothesis at least worth considering, and at least worth the possible exploration. And the fact of the matter is, the reason we don't do it is because it costs a lot of money, and maybe we need to give it a try. Okay, that's my first idea. My second idea is this slide alone, and this I'm not going to explain it. I'm just going to tell you in one sentence, since Dan is strangling me right now, here's what this is. This is a causal model that our group, the BPS group here at Stanford, has built to try to describe the factors that cause bad behavior by scientists and the interventions that could be done to, you're right, you're distracted, I'm going to take it off, okay. And could then, the factors that could mitigate those bad behaviors. And so just as a simple illustration, we've heard a lot about transparency so far. We have, in our model, simply raised the question, what is transparency going to do? Why? What impact is it going to have? And how do we know it's actually going to help anything? We would want to think this through because it's a problem of human behavior. So the second proposal I would make is that building and testing causal models of scientist behavior may be worthwhile. Thank you, Dan.
Okay, thank you.